Shelley, please.
Thank you, Ms. Toastmaster. When I was young, I believed I could change the world. I thought with passion and action, I could make change and improve the world. I found over the years that this is not always the case. In the 60s, there was a movement called feminism, and I became a feminist. But I found over the years that feminist had become a bad word. When the women's liberation movement began in the early 60s, women did not have the same rights, the same opportunities as men. It was noticed that women were not equal socially, politically, or financially, and I wanted to get involved in making change in that sphere. It was noticed also that women did not have the same opportunities for professions. They were given a very narrow box. They could be a homemaker, they could be a secretary, possibly a teacher. My mother wanted to have a career outside the home. And when she said she wanted that to my father, he said, "You can have a career outside the home as long as you're home to put dinner on the table at 6 o'clock. My Aunt Carol, who is my mom's sister, wanted to become a lawyer. And my grandmother said, "You can become a lawyer. As long as you're aware, you'll probably be the only woman in the class." And indeed, she did become a lawyer. She became one of the first practicing lawyers in the province of Manitoba. But you should see her graduating photo. There she is, sitting primly in the middle of the class, surrounded by a sea of 40 men. In those days, when you would fill in an application form, a man could be known as Mr. There were no other options. But for a woman, we could be either Miss or Mrs. We had to be defined by our marital status. In the 60s, along with many of the women's movements, invented a new name for women called Ms. I have always been Ms. Warner. In the early stages of the women's movement, there were some very powerful women that took the lead. Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. Gloria Steinem wrote a book that was very popular and, more importantly, started a magazine called Ms. Magazine. Ms. Magazine advocated for the rights of women, and Gloria Steinem herself was a journalist. And she gave me one of my favorite quotes. When asked by a man, "How is it she looks so good at the age of 50?" she said, "This is what 50 looks like." She believed that women didn't have to be put into a narrow box, and that we were not Barbie dolls, and we were all different and should all be welcome no matter how we looked. I myself took steps to make change in the world. I read books like Sisterhood is Powerful that showed how women could join together and make change as a group. I read the book called The Woman's Room. The Woman's Room talked about how stereotyping in our culture was everywhere. For example, on the washroom door for a man, it said men. On the washroom door for the women, it said girls. And you can often hear people say, "I'm going to the little girls' room." Why am I going to the girls' room? I'm a grown woman. In addition to reading those kinds of books, I also marched down the streets of Winnipeg saying, "Women unite, take back the night," because I wanted the world to know that women did not have to be pegged into a certain narrow box. We should be able to walk the streets freely. So let's fast forward now, many years later. I'm the manager of a furniture company. I'm standing outside our office. It's a beautiful day. I'm talking to one of our new designers, one of our new hires. And I ask her to tell me a bit about herself. She says she's a designer, she's a mother, but I'm not a feminist, she said. Well, she didn't know who she was talking to. So I said to her, "Okay, let me ask you this question. Do you believe in work of equal value for equal pay? In other words, a man does the same job as a woman and they should get paid the same?" And she said, "Well, of course I do." I said, "All right, let me ask you a second question. Do you could believe that you could be anything you want? Do you believe you could be the prime minister? You could run for office. You could have a career in any of your chosen professions?" And she said to me, "Well, obviously." I said to her, "Okay, I got one more question for you. Do you think you should be able to dress any way you want? that you should be able to get up in the morning, put on the clothes that you wish, and not have it look like you want men to look at you. She said, of course I do. I said to her, well, then you are a feminist. And she looked at me and I said, you are standing on the shoulders of the women who came before you. You are a person who is taking advantage of all those years of activism. My mother worked for you to have those rights. Gloria Steinem worked for you to have those rights. So I think you need to think about whether you think feminist is a bad word. She looked at me and she said, well, I guess you're right. I guess I am a feminist. And the moral of the story of that for me is maybe I can change the world, even if only one person at a time. Madam Toastmaster.